Welcome to the interview series. The interview series is a production of the Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit 1 Week Critique, which provides pedagogical resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about our programs, support our work, or view the comparative text of our interviewees' work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm al-Sirgany, here today with Lilly Dancyger. Hello, Lilly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Lilly is the author of First Love, Forthcoming, an essay collection about the power and complexity of female friendship, and Negative Space, a reported and illustrated memoir selected by Carmen Maria Machado as a winner of the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Awards, and the editor of Burn It Down, a 2019 critically acclaimed anthology of essays on women's anger from Seal Press. Today, we're going to be looking at a development of a chapter from Lilly's memoir, Negative Space, published last year by Santa Fe Writers Project. So Lilly, Negative Space, I wrote down as sort of a personal memoir, art book, argument for the ongoing interest in the life and art of your father, Joe Shackman. For the sake of those who haven't read the book yet, if you haven't read the book yet, go buy the book. It's also on Audible, I found out. And those, for those who haven't read it and are going to find it in one of those spaces, can you tell us a little bit about the 80s East Village art scene and lay the groundwork for the book and why you've written it and written it in this particularly expansive way?
Yeah, so like you said, it's a memoir, it's an art book, it's an investigation, it's a bunch of different things, and it kind of evolved starting as an archive and a monograph of my father's work. And as you mentioned, my father, Joe Shackman, was part of the gallery scene in the East Village in the 80s, where everything was very DIY, and people could rent out gallery spaces for very little money and put on shows for each other. And it was just a very special and cool time in the city's art history. David Wojnarowicz and like Basquiat and Keith Haring came out of that era. But there are also a lot of really amazing artists who never got that kind of name recognition, my father being one of them. And so I wanted to kind of immortalize his work and also understand him better, because he died when I was 12 and I still had a very idealized image of him. So this book is kind of sharing his work with the world, and it's also a process of me trying to come to terms with who he was as a complicated person, a brilliant artist, and also a heroin addict, and split up with my mom when I was 7 and wasn't around a lot, and then died when I was young. So it's a lot of different things.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I know we're going to get into some of the different things, but I think that is one of the great accomplishments of the book, that it manages to juggle an enormous number of cultural and personal objects, for lack of a better term. To that end, it shouldn't surprise me that you mentioned this book took a long time to do all that juggling. You wrote to me that it was 11 years, not an unheard of long time for a book, not an unreasonable amount of time for all of the things that you're dealing with. I'm hoping that we'll have a larger conversation about the book's trajectory, but because I assume much of the editing of this work was built around your own sort of developing understandings of your father, I think that is fairly clear within the context of the work itself. I'd love it if you could lay out a little background and lead up to the scene that we're going to look at with your father's friend, Mark Rounds, and how we got there.
Yeah, so this chunk of the story is pretty early on. Mark is my godfather, and he's one of the first people I interviewed when I was looking outward for people who could tell me things about my father that I didn't know, and that weren't reflected in his journals and letters and stuff. And Mark and my father went to art school together in the 70s and remained close for a long time. And so this conversation with Mark is kind of the entry point into the like biography monograph aspect of the book, where I start kind of casting a wider net. And yeah, the evolution of it really also had to do with the shifting perspective, where originally I just was trying to give people the facts. And it's like, you know, he went to school here, he graduated here, he dropped out at this year, he made this series during this time period. But that was a little dry and flat. And it took some time for me to realize that that wasn't going to be interesting to anybody other than me. You know, that's people will read a straightforward artist biography like that if it's an artist they already know and care about. But I had that task of making people care about this artist that they had never heard of. And the way to do that was to show my personal stakes in finding this story, and kind of widen the lens a little bit to show my experience of uncovering these things, which you'll see there's a lot more of in the final revised draft of this scene.
Sure. So let's start by maybe taking a look at the first draft of that scene, letting people get a taste of what that's about.
Yeah, so this is, you know, I was going to read a little short part of this longer scene, just so you can get a sense of how much it expands in the revision. So just looking at the bottom of this page, say in 1978, the summer before his junior year at Tyler, Papa went to the Yale Summer School of Art and Music. That's where he met beautiful, blonde, rich, and reckless Kathy Worley, referred to by Mark, Amy, and my mother as, quote, his first great love. He returned to Tyler after the summer program ended, but shortly thereafter, he dropped out and moved to New Haven to be with Kathy. Most of the people I've been able to interview met my father after Kathy died, so they can't speak to what she was like or the details of their relationship, but they were all struck by her lasting effect on him. Mark remembers her from when he visited Joe in New Haven in 76 and 77. Kathy was a friggin' whirlwind, he said. Joe's nickname for her was Whirlybird. So that's, you know, just pretty straightforward introducing this character.
Sure. So one thing I'm particularly captivated by actually is that over time you reconceive this book in several ways. One of them is that, at least within the samples that you've shared with us, the characters get more expansive. And you mentioned already that that was about connecting to an audience that wasn't familiar with your father and his work. I think it's also, you know, a pretty remarkable thing that as a young person, when the project starts, you had the self-awareness on some level to know that the project wasn't over, which ends up doing this amazing thing within the context of the book of getting to watch your own emotional development in relationship to the way that you would think about your father, his art, his death, his life. And so, you know, as a reader, I get to go on that journey with you a little bit, and feel the pathos for you, as these really complicated things happen to you as a young person, but also you get to check my own kind of cynical readerly doubt. What about this? And I get, as a reader, to watch you grow with that. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how and why you chose to keep investigating these questions, and why you did that for more than a decade, and the ways that changed what you wrote and how you wrote it over time.
Yeah. So at several points in the process, I thought I was done. You know, and the first draft that I shared that for that I just read from is not even really the first draft. That's the first finished draft. That's like the first time I thought the book was done, you know, and there had already been a lot of revision going into that. But I think that's the earliest draft I still have on my Google Drive. And it, you know, I think it was less that I knew it wasn't done, or like I didn't, you know, I kind of had to keep confronting these limits. You know, I reached the end of the project that I was doing as I conceived it at the time, and thought, okay, I'm done. And then realized that people weren't reacting to it in the way that I wanted them to. You know, I think I queried with that version of the book and sent it out to agents and got some very kind, like, you know, nobody's going to publish this. What is it? It's an art book about an artist we've never heard of. Sorry, try again, you know, and had to kind of go back to the drawing board over and over again and push myself to reconceive the project and think of, okay, how do I make this bigger? How do I make it deeper? How do I make it something that people other than, friends and family of my father are going to care about?
Yeah.
And that took a long time. I think that's why it took, over a decade, was because I didn't set out to write the book that I ended up writing at all. I set out to write this much narrower, simpler book, and I wrote it and I finished it. It just wasn't very good. So then I had to push myself and really stretch the limits of what I felt like I was capable of. And along the way, I also had to learn how to do that, and I set out with a journalist mindset and had to kind of become a memoirist over the course of the years in order to be able to execute this project in the way that it demanded.
Yeah. Can I pull on that thread a little bit? You do talk in the book a little bit about going to Columbia, studying journalism. And I'd mentioned to you that over time, I think of the book as maintaining a sense of the journalistic and for the level of emotionality that you have to experience to write through your father's death and life and the many complicated things that come along with heroin addiction and old lovers and your own drug use, etc. That's not an easy task. And you have this, to the degree that any journalist can be, remarkably objective gaze about it. But the sentences have gotten lovely over time, and they have this remarkable flow. And I think apart from that attention to detail and narrative flow, there's also, you are moving back and forth in time between your own life and your father's life, and occasionally pulling in research in journalistic ways, but breaking that up into a flowing project that I think of as being a little like some of Masha Gessen's work or something. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can talk about how you did that interweaving and structuring over time and how that developed for you.
Yeah. So that weaving didn't come until much later. That was like 9 years into the project or something. That whole second storyline of my life, which, currently now the book actually starts there, kind of in my perspective, starting with my father's death, and then my kind of teenage spinning out after that, and eventually going to Columbia and etc. That wasn't in there at all until much later. And that was my final concession to, the feedback that I kept getting, readers wanting more of me on the page. And before then, I had tried several times to get away with just sprinkling little bits of my life and like a scene here and a sentence of reflection there. And it just wasn't enough. And I was holding back, and people could tell. And I kept getting that feedback of like, where are you? This is a memoir, but you're not on the page anywhere. And so I finally stopped trying to do it halfway and was like, okay, fine. I'm going to give myself a whole storyline, and I will actually put my life in here, not just the little bits and pieces that directly connect to my father's life. And so by the time I did that, the, primary storyline or my father's life and art and all the research and all that was already written and done and structured. And, it was a complete book that I had to kind of break apart and cut big chunks out of and splice the secondary narrative in throughout, which was difficult, but also gave me at least some structural framework, and I think allowed some of that back and forth to grow sort of organically, because I had an existing structure, and I split it into its smallest units so that I could identify the spaces between chunks of my father's story where bits of my story could fit. And then I wrote out this whole long narrative of my life and was trying to figure out like what's relevant, what isn't, and I wrote like almost a whole other book and then cut it in half and then cut it into pieces and spliced it in. So it was I took the long way around basically at every stage of this project, but that's the short version of how that came together.
Yeah, no, I think that it ends up doing a lot of remarkable things that I will leave to readers to read about. But I think that it does a fantastic job of thinking out the unintended consequences of our lives and the way in which we connect to our experiences. And I think it's a rare book that manages addiction and drug use effectively and honestly without either aggrandizing it or, berating it.
Thank you. Yeah, that was challenging for sure. Trying not to make it salacious, but also trying not to sugarcoat.
For sure. And speaking of sugarcoating, or not sugarcoating, as it were, can we take a look at your later draft that is much more in detail about Kathy Worley and Mark Round and your father?
Yeah. So in the revision, there's also kind of a whole section before this where I explain, who Mark is to me in addition to who he was to my father, and kind of set the scene of me taking the bus to Philadelphia and showing up at his house and seeing him. And, the whole thing is much more, I think, grounded and seen. Yeah. And so this is partway through this conversation with Mark. He told me about the classes they liked and didn't, the people they liked and didn't, and about the first apartment they shared sophomore year. He told me about the stuffy still life paintings Joe was doing when they met, and how he slowly developed his own style when he branched out and explored other mediums. And about how Joe went to a summer program at Yale before his junior year. That was where he met Kathy, he said, offhand, like, of course I knew that already. Wait, you knew Kathy? I interrupted. I remembered whispers of the name Kathy from when I was a kid. Nobody had ever told me anything about her directly, but I'd heard her name spoken like a secret by the adults when they shared stories of the old days. Electric and hushed. Eventually, I'd pieced together enough to understand that Kathy was a woman my father had loved before my mother. As a child, the idea of a parent's first love, an alternate storyline love, feels unreal, mythical. Now that I was searching for new ways to understand my father, the idea of his first love was more enthralling than ever. I was fascinated by the idea of Kathy. I wanted to sit down with her and have her tell me long stories about my father in those early days. I wanted every detail of what he looked like and sounded like back then, just entering adulthood, like I was now. I wanted a level of detail about his facial expressions and interests and particularities that only a lover would remember. But I couldn't ask Kathy for these stories because one of the very few things I knew about her was that she died a long time ago. But now I thought maybe Mark could bring her to life for me. And then I had another ghost to chase. Stop there.
Yeah, thank you.
So much better.
Yeah, it's so much
say
better.
That.
I think it's better for a lot of reasons. I think the sentences have this movement, and I think that kind of mix of the short and the hypotactic has a flow about it. And it's wonderful to hear you read that flow and hear that move. I think it's also so much more vivid and engaging because of that grounding. And that also makes this section a lot longer. Our audience won't know this unless they go to the website and take a look at the complete version of this. But one thing that struck me is actually very simple. The way that you introduce Mark in the original version just compares his voice to Johnny Cash's, and lets the reader know that Mark had tricked you into thinking that he was Johnny Cash. Which later on, we actually get this much more expansive world where you're a 3-year-old at a bar listening to Mark sing, and the whole experience of that believability, but also just the kind of odd artistic space that you were growing up in and that was normalized for you as a child becomes so much more real. I think through that, we also learn a lot more about Kathy and Travis the dog and your father, and a number of characters that, both in terms of understanding your father's art, what it looks like, why it developed in the way it did, it works a little like Patti Smith's Just Kids or something, where the whole context becomes so much clearer. That's it. It's a longer book for it, right? So I'm wondering if can you talk a little bit about that choice to make it longer and to go for that, and what the virtues of those more scenic and descriptions of Kathy and who she is. And
Yeah. So I expanded the individual pieces a lot, right? Like this, the reason I picked this example is because this was one that feels emblematic of, like, in the original draft, it was just like, and then he dropped out of art school and went to live with this girl, Kathy. Moving on, next fact, right? But in the revision, I tried to give every detail some meaning and some stakes, and showing my reaction to that, and and it comes back later with what I had understood to be his motivation for dropping out of school, and how I had used that to justify dropping out of high school myself, and how learning that it actually was about a girl kind of upended all of that. So expanding those little details, but in doing that, I also cut a ton, because if I had expanded the whole thing on that level, it would have been like 300 pages. And that was even just his storyline, right? Not even the like 20,000 or 30,000 or so words of my storyline that I added. But it really was about trying to make it immersive and trying to build a sense of suspense into the details of a life where from the beginning that he dies.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the trick for myself, as to how to get people to feel invested in the twists and turns of this story about a person who's a step removed from me, right? In memoir, that's the trick to begin with, right? Is making people invested in you and your life and your choices. But how to do that when it's not even you're talking about. And so grounding these revelations about his life in scenes that I'm present for was kind of one of the trick that I used to do that, right? And so showing the reader very immediately and tangibly what each of these revelations meant to me by showing me learning them and reacting to them and thinking about them. It required a lot more space than just the one sentence, he dropped out and moved to New Haven.
Yeah, no, I think I've been thinking a lot about that, because the book does still feel very, very swift. In some ways, the 9 pages you sent me of a final draft read faster than 3.5 of the original draft, and I've been thinking out how that works for you. You got that?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that it also moves through and creates this much more vivid world. We started corresponding, I don't know, 4 or 5, 6 months ago or something about this book, and I'd read it back then, and it both is a fast-moving book, and it's one that stopped me in my tracks a lot. In my own experience, I've dealt with a lot of addicts and a lot of neurodivergent folk and a lot of artists, and they all can be difficult in many, many ways. And there's something so articulate about the way that you describe this scene, and why this art scene, and why it doesn't look quite like that, even though there are still galleries in the East Village now, and a changing New York, and many other things. I don't usually ask people that much about sort of the ethics of their books, but I am interested in hashing some of that out with you, both because I think your experience as an essayist, as a memoirist, as a journalist offers a unique perspective on the different ways we might think about that. Also, as I mentioned, I think you deal with both the realities of all of those spaces, whether it's New York, your childhood, pornography, class difference, drug use. All of these things come into the book swiftly, and they keep stopping me because I still feel profoundly upset about what's happening to people.
Yeah.
That was a long lead up to ask, or to tell you, I guess, that I'm interested in the introduction of Kathy in particular. I think she's a pretty good case study of the many complicated characters in the book, maybe because she's the least sort of yours and present to work with or to give you permission to present her life on the page.
Yeah.
But I think that's true. I mean, it's differently true and interesting of the way that you dealt with your mother or the way that you've dealt with your father, etc. It seems like Mark has been pretty open and giving. But can you tell us a little bit about that and how you've thought that through and worked that through as you're working out the 90 other things you've mentioned?
Yeah. It was definitely interesting, thinking about the way that the ethics of the project kind of evolved along with the genre of it. But then there were some things that I held on to, somebody told me after the book was published, like, wow, I can't believe you used all these people's full names, like first and last names. And I was like, yeah, why wouldn't I? I was telling a story. These are the characters. These are their names. And, I think there was that piece of it where before it was a memoir, it was an archival project and it was a journalistic project. And so putting the facts out there, even the ugly ones, and, and using people's real names felt important to that. It's recording a bit of history as much as it's recording my life. But then, yeah, as it evolved into memoir, it got a little trickier where there are kind of different rules for how much you share about other people. And there were a couple thorny spots, and Kathy definitely is one of them, because, yeah, like you said, she died before I was born. She's the only character who I'm writing about at that kind of double remove where I never met her. I'm only hearing other people talk about her. But I did speak with her sister. Her sister Joni was a good friend of my father's for the rest of his life. They stayed close after Kathy died, and I spoke with Joni about Kathy early on. I didn't end up using a lot of what she told me, more for stylistic reasons. I was trying to kind of focus on one interview per section so that I could keep it very scene based, as opposed to bringing in lots of voices in a more journalistic way like I did initially. And I definitely, double checked facts about Kathy with Joni to make sure that I was getting them right. But yeah, I don't know. I think overall I gave myself a lot of permission, just because I'm creating a record, and this is what happened. So, and I definitely, there are people in my life who are not thrilled about that, but that just is what the project demanded of me. So that's how I did it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the worst transition of all time, but so one thing, I don't know who owns your father's estate, etc. But one thing that presumably you didn't get the author's permission for, is you've included some images, and you've shared a lot of his images, which I think is part of the point of the book, to give folks an opportunity to engage the work that your father did. And I'm wondering if you can speak to just a little bit about his art and why you've chosen to include it in a text in this way as it became memoir.
Yeah, I mean, the art was really the original impetus for the whole project. And it's been such a big part of my life, and is so meaningful for me. And I'm surrounded by it. You can see several pieces of it on my wall and on my shelves behind me. And a lot of it is, he worked with not always, it's called archival material. So, one of my favorite pieces that's in my living room is paper mache, and it's 30-year-old paper mache, and it's crumbling. And every time I move, little bits of it fall off. And I just am very viscerally aware of the actual literal physical deterioration of a lot of the work. And also the fact that when I and his closest friends die, he would have been completely lost to history. He died before everything was on the internet. He didn't overlap with social media at all. I've thought about like, would he even be on social media if he was alive now? But that's a whole other question. But there was no like internet record of him, and I think that his artwork is really special and powerful and beautiful, and I wanted there to be this record of it. I wanted to create an object so that the memory of the significance of the work was not this intangible thing that would disappear when I died, basically, is the most straightforward version of why.
No, I think it's incredible work, worth saying. You should go buy the book. You should go see the work. That said, where can folks buy your book, Lilly? Where can they connect with your editorial services? Where can they see Joe Shachtman's work when they're not watching this interview and staring at your shoulder?
Yeah. So I still haven't created any kind of internet archive, although that is on my would love to do list someday. But for now, the best place to see the work is in the book, which you can buy wherever books are sold, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, The Evil Empire, or directly from SFWP, or on my website, which is lillydancyger.com.
Cool. Well, Lilly, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat out this book with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a really cool project.
Yeah. Go buy Negative Space.